The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel seemed to mock me with its blinding, shattered light as the icy crimson liquid soaked through the cheap fabric of my dress. I hadn't even seen Chloe Sterling approach. 1 second. I was double-checking the guest list for the Thorn Enterprises annual gala, ensuring every billionaire and socialite was perfectly catered to. And the next, Julian's beautiful, statuesque fiancée was gasping in mock horror. An empty wine glass dangling from her perfectly manicured fingers. Oh my God. Maya, why would you do that? Chloe wailed, her voice carrying a theatrical tremor that instantly sliced through the ambient jazz music. She hadn't spilled the wine on herself. She had deliberately thrown the entire glass of vintage Merlot onto my pale beige blazer, making it look as though we had struggled. The dark stain spread across my chest like a bleeding wound, drawing the predatory gaze of every high society guest in the room. I stood there, a Curvy, exhausted assistant in a sea of haute couture, clutching my tablet as whispers began to ripple through the crowd like venomous snakes. The immediate hush that fell over the ballroom was suffocating, thick with the kind of wealthy entitlement that thrived on the public destruction of the working class. Chloe pressed a diamond-ringed hand to her chest, hair wide, innocent blue eyes brimming with expertly summoned tears as she stepped back from me. Trembling, I just asked you to fetch me a napkin. Maya, I know you resent me. I know you think you belong by Julian's side because you've worked for him for 5 years. But to attack me, the sheer audacity of her lie left me momentarily paralyzed. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain that I had been standing alone by the catering tables. But the judging eyes of the elite had already convicted me. They looked at my full figure, my off-the-rack clothes, and my flushed face, immediately painting me as the jealous, unhinged secretary obsessed with her handsome, billionaire boss. The murmurs grew louder, filled with words like pathetic, delusional, and trash, wrapping around my throat and tightening until I could barely draw a breath. Just as I stepped forward to hand Chloe my own handkerchief, hoping to de-escalate the manufactured drama, the crowd parted like the Red Sea to make way for the king. Julian Thorne strode into the circle, his custom Italian suit impeccably tailored, his jaw clenched in that familiar expression of absolute, ruthless authority that I had spent 5 years helping him cultivate. For a split second, my racing heart found a pathetic rhythm of hope. This was Julian, the man I had pulled out of the gutters of his own incompetence, the man whose schedules, secrets, and financial blunders I had meticulously managed and fixed, while he took all the credit. Surely, he knew me better than this. Surely, he would see the obvious theatricality of Chloe's performance, read the exhaustion in my eyes, and quietly handled the situation. Instead, he didn't even look at the wine dripping from my hem. He wrapped a protective arm around Chloe, pulling her delicate frame against his chest, before turning his gaze toward me, a gaze so profoundly devoid of warmth it felt like a physical blow to my ribs. Maya. Julian's voice was dangerously low, a silken threat that carried effortlessly over the sudden silence of the ballroom. I have tolerated your incompetence and your blatant lack of professionalism because of your tenure, but this crosses the line. Before I could utter a single syllable of protest, he raised his free hand, holding up a thick, red-tabbed folder that I instantly recognized. It was the confidential financial audit but the man standing just behind Julian's shoulder, refusing to meet my eyes, was Liam, my supposed best friend at the company, the junior analyst I had trained from scratch. Liam just handed me the verified reports. Julian continued, his voice rising in volume, ensuring the entire front row of investors and board members could hear every damning word. You've been embezzling company funds, Maya, siphoning off hundreds of thousands into dummy accounts, thinking you could hide it in the quarterly shadows. You didn't just attack my fiancée tonight. You've been bleeding my company dry to fund a lifestyle you could never naturally afford. The accusation hit me with the force of a freight train, knocking the air from my lungs and leaving me dizzy with shock. Julian, that is a lie, I choked out, my voice trembling but loud enough to fight back. I have never touched a single cent of Thorn Enterprises money. Liam knows that I am the one who flagged the discrepancies in the accounts yesterday. But Liam kept his gaze glued to the marble floor. His silence, a deafening confirmation of his betrayal. Julian let out a cruel, barking laugh that echoed through the grand hall, dripping with absolute contempt. Please, Maya, don't embarrass yourself further. We all know why you did it. You thought if you bought expensive clothes and tried to morph yourself into someone of our class, I would finally look at you. He swept his gaze up and down my curvy figure, his lip curling in unmistakable disgust. You thought you could buy my affection. You're nothing but a pathetic, gold-digging opportunist who couldn't accept that a man like me would never touch a woman like you. The cruelty of his words was meant to break me, and judging by the erupting laughter and cruel snickers from the audience, he was succeeding in his public execution. But Julian wasn't finished. He wanted maximum theatricality to cement his power in front of his shareholders, releasing Chloe. He strode over to the podium used for the evening's speeches, grabbed the microphone, and turned the volume up. The feedback whined sharply before his voice boomed through the speakers, shaking the crystal chandeliers above. To everyone present, I apologize for this disruption, he announced, his eyes locked onto mine, enjoying the terror he thought he saw in them. Effective, immediately. Maya Vance is terminated from Thorn Enterprises. Not only is she fired, but my legal team will be pressing full criminal charges for corporate theft and harassment by morning. Security will escort this delusional thief off the premises. Take a good look. Everyone. This is what happens when the help forgets their place and tries to climb into beds they don't belong in. The humiliation was absolute. A searing fire that burned away every ounce of the naive, exhausted loyalty I had harbored for this man over 5 grueling years. As 2 massive security guards approached me from the flanks, Julian stepped down from the podium and walked right up to me, invading my personal space. Get out of my sight. He said, so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. As he spoke, his eyes darted to the simple, worn leather cord resting against my collarbone. Attached to it was an old, tarnished, bronze key, the only piece of jewelry I ever wore, a stark contrast to the diamonds glittering around us. And take your cheap, pathetic trash with you, he sneered, raising his hand. With a violent, sudden yerk, he hooked his finger beneath the cord and ripped it from my neck. The leather snapped, slicing a stinging red line across my skin, and the heavy bronze key clattered loudly against the pristine glass floor. Spinning until it came to a dead stop between my scuffed heels. For a moment, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. The music was dead. The whispers faded into a distant white noise. I stared down at the tarnished bronze key resting on the glass, feeling the sting on my neck where the cord had cut me. Julian expected me to break. Louis, peeking out from behind his shoulder, had a triumphant, sickening smirk on her face, waiting for the tears, the begging, the ugly collapse of the woman she despised. But as I looked from that key up to Julian's arrogant, sneering face, something inside me didn't break. It crystallized. The frantic, desperately loyal assistant who worked 80-hour weeks, who covered his mistakes, who endured his tantrums, simply ceased to exist. In her place, a cold, absolute clarity flooded my veins. He didn't know. He truly, genuinely had no idea what he had just done. He thought he was discarding a useless piece of trash, completely unaware that he had just severed the only lifeline keeping his fragile, inherited empire from crumbling into dust. I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I slowly bent down, ignoring the mocking stares of the billionaires surrounding me, and closed my fingers around the cold, heavy bronze metal of the key. When I stood back up, I didn't look like a humiliated secretary anymore. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the wine dripping down my front, and met Julian's gaze with a chilling, dead-eyed stare that made his smug smile momentarily falter. I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice, so only he, Clue, and the traitorous Liam could hear the absolute certainty in my tone. You just burned your own kingdom to the ground. Julian, I said softly, the words slicing through the air sharper than any blade. Without waiting for the security guards to grab me, I turned on my heel and walked toward the grand exit. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps echoing loudly against the marble. Let them laugh. Let them think they had won. Tomorrow, the true owner of Thorn Enterprises would rise from these ashes. The morning after the gala, the skies over Manhattan broke open. Weeping, freezing rain that matched the chilling hostility of the Thorn Enterprises corporate lobby. I wasn't allowed to enter through the front doors. 2 burly security guards intercepted me at the service elevator, their faces hard and unyielding. They handed me a single cardboard box and gave me exactly 15 minutes to clear out 5 years of my life. Walking onto the 82nd floor felt like stepping into a graveyard. The sleek, glass-walled office I had practically lived in managing crises, drafting contracts, and saving Julian from his own catastrophic impulsiveness was now a crime scene. My former colleagues, people I had bought birthday cakes for and covered shifts for, refused to make eye contact. They stared at their monitors, their silence a heavy, suffocating blanket of complicity. I methodically packed my few personal belongings, a cheap coffee mug, a pair of spare flats, and a framed photograph of myself and the late chairman, Richard Thorne. The old man was the only reason I had ever stayed in this venomous snake pit. As I reached for the frame, a trembling hand suddenly slammed down on my desk, startling me out of my bitter reverie. I looked up to see Liam, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guards waiting by the elevator banks. This was the junior analyst I had mentored, the kid whose mistakes I had covered up, The friend who had eaten takeout with me during countless all-nighters. Maya? I didn't have a choice. He whispered, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation. Chloe found out about my mother's gambling debts. She threatened to have the company audit my personal accounts. To ruin me. But then she offered me a way out. She paid off the $500,000 debt. Maya, all I had to do was plant those dummy accounts under your credential logs and hand Julian the folder. The sheer audacity of his confession made my stomach churn with a sickening cocktail of grief and rage. He wasn't apologizing for destroying my life. He was begging for absolution to ease his own cowardly guilt. He actually expected me to understand, to pat his hand and tell him it was okay that he had fed me to the wolves to save his own skin. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. The tears I might have shed for his betrayal had already dried up the moment Julian ripped the bronze key from my neck the night before. I placed the photograph of the late chairman into my box, taking a slow, deliberate breath before finally meeting Liam's terrified gaze. You sold 5 years of loyalty for $500,000. Liam, I said, my voice eerily calm, stripping away the warm, maternal tone I had always used with him. Chloe didn't just buy your silence, she bought your soul. And the tragic irony is that when the audit she orchestrated eventually blows back on this company, she will use you as the primary scapegoat. And Julian won't lift a single finger to save you. Liam visibly recoiled, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. But no words came out. I picked up my cardboard box, brushing past his trembling shoulder without a second glance. Consider the debt settled. I threw over my shoulder, walking toward the security guards, because when Thorn Enterprises goes down, I won't be here to pull you from the wreckage. The guards escorted me out through the loading dock, practically shoving me onto the slick, rain-washed pavement of the alleyway. The freezing Manhattan downpour instantly soaked through my thin trench coat, plastering my hair to my face and chilling me to the bone. I stood there, clutching my pathetic little cardboard box, completely isolated from the world I had dedicated my entire adult life to building. Cars rushed by on the avenue, splashing dirty water onto the sidewalks, while the towering glass monolith of Thorn Enterprises loomed above me like a glittering monument to my own foolishness. I had allowed Julian to convince me that my worth was tied to my utility, that my curvy figure and working-class background meant I had to work 10 times harder just to earn a scrap of basic respect. They thought this reign, this humiliation, and this absolute emotional isolation would break me. They thought I would crawl back to my tiny apartment, cry myself to sleep, and disappear into the shadows of the city like a good, obedient victim. But the biting cold only sharpened my senses, washing away the last lingering remnants of the dutiful, subservient assistant. My cell phone began to vibrate violently in my coat pocket, the harsh buzzing cutting through the rhythmic drumming of the rain. I pulled it out, half expecting a final threat from the legal department, only to see Julian's private number flashing on the cracked screen. I swiped to answer, bringing the phone to my ear without saying a word. Well, if it isn't the disgraced thief. Julian's arrogant, silken voice sneered through the speaker. In the background, I could hear the unmistakable clinking of champagne flutes and Chloe's breathy, triumphant laughter. They were in the penthouse suite, celebrating their flawless victory, reveling in the public execution of the one woman who knew exactly how hollow their empire truly was. I hope you're enjoying the weather. Maya, I just wanted to personally inform you that the board is drafting the final press release regarding your termination. Chloe has graciously offered to step in and oversee the transition of your department. You are officially erased from this company. His cruelty was meant to twist the knife, to ensure I felt the absolute, crushing weight of my new reality. But his gloating abruptly faltered, replaced by the muffled sound of a hand covering the receiver and a frantic, hushed argument. When Julian came back on the line, the smug satisfaction had vanished entirely, replaced by a tight, barely controlled edge of panic. Maya, stop playing games. Chloe is trying to access the Q3 projections and the offshore legacy trusts to present to the board this afternoon. But the master drives are locked. You changed the administrative passwords before you left. Didn't you? The desperation bleeding into his tone was the sweetest sound I had heard in years. Julian was a figurehead, a handsome puppet who knew how to charm investors at galas but had absolutely no idea how the lifeblood of his own corporation actually flowed. He had just handed the keys of a complex, fragile machine to his spoiled fiancée, only to discover the engine was secured behind a vault they couldn't breach. Give me the decryption keys right now, Julian demanded, his voice rising in volume, echoing the same unhinged entitlement he had displayed in the ballroom. This is company property, and you are illegally withholding it. When I remained completely silent, simply standing in the freezing rain and listening to his unraveling composure, Julian completely lost his temper. Did you hear me? You fat, delusional bitch, he roared into the phone, shattering his polished billionaire facade. If you don't give me those passwords in the next 30 seconds, I am calling the NYPD. I will tell them you locked the system as a final act of corporate sabotage. I will have you arrested. Maya, I will make sure you spend the next 10 years rotting in a federal prison. And I will personally see to it that your credit is so destroyed, you won't even be able to rent a cardboard box in this city. You are nothing without me. You have no money, no power, and no one who will believe your pathetic lies. Give Chloe the goddamn access codes, or I will end you. His threats were violent, escalating wildly as his terror grew. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that the incompetent assistant he had just publicly humiliated was the only person keeping his grandfather's empire afloat. I let him scream until his breath hitched, savoring the absolute impotence hidden beneath his rage. The rain battered my face, but I felt a warm, terrifying smile spread slowly across my lips. Julian, I finally spoke, my voice dropping to a glacial, deadly whisper that made the line go dead silent. I didn't change the passwords. I didn't lock you out of spite. The truth is much simpler and infinitely more pathetic. I paused, letting the silence stretch until I could practically hear his heart pounding through the cellular connection. You are locked out of the legacy trusts and the core data because you never had the security clearance to access them in the first place. Your grandfather didn't trust you. Julian, he knew exactly what you and Chloe were. Those files require the authorization of the majority shareholder, and unfortunately for you, that person isn't taking your calls anymore. Before he could scream another threat, before he could process the catastrophic reality of my words, I ended the call. I powered down the phone, walked over to a nearby trash can, and dropped the device inside. severing my final tie to Julian Thorne. I left the cardboard box, sitting on the wet pavement, abandoning the cheap coffee mug and the pathetic remnants of Maya, the assistant. Reaching under my collar, I felt the phantom weight of the bronze key that Julian had ripped away. But its absence no longer felt like a loss. It felt like an unchaining. I turned my back on the Thorne Enterprises building and began to walk. I didn't walk toward the subway, and I didn't head toward my cramped apartment in Queens. I walked 3 blocks down Madison Avenue, the freezing rain washing away the last traces of my subservience, until I stood before a massive, hyper-modern skyscraper constructed entirely of black glass and steel. There was no gaudy logo, only a discreet, brushed platinum plaque near the revolving doors that read Vanguard Apex. This was the most ruthless, secretive, and powerful private equity firm on the eastern seaboard. The security guards at the entrance, unlike the brutes at Thorne, immediately stood at attention, opening the doors for me without a single word. I stepped out of the rain and into the pristine, hushed lobby of my actual domain. The terrified, curvy assistant was dead. It was time for the true apex predator to take the throne. 3 days after my unceremonious exile, the financial tectonic plates beneath Thorne Enterprises began to violently shift from the serene, high-tech command center of my penthouse office at Vanguard Apex. I watched the chaos unfold across a wall of Bloomberg terminals. The red lines of Thorne's stock price were plunging with the grace of a dying bird. Without me, there to manually authorize the shadow transfers and placate the international vendors, the supply chain simply froze. Julian had always assumed his charismatic smile and old money last name kept the Japanese tech suppliers and the European distributors in line, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one negotiating the margins at 3 a.m. Now, the phones on the executive floor of Thorne Enterprises were ringing incessantly, demanding answers that Julian didn't have. My Vanguard intelligence team reported that Julian had locked himself in his office, screaming at his department heads and desperately trying to bluff his way through conference calls with men who could smell his incompetence through the receiver. The golden boy of Manhattan was rapidly realizing that his crown was made of paper, and I had just lit the match. Panic is a highly contagious disease, and it didn't take long for it to infect Chloe Sterling. Realizing that Julian's ship was sinking faster than anticipated, she attempted to bypass him entirely, calling an emergency meeting with the minority board members to solidify her position. She strutted into the boardroom, draped in designer silk, slamming Liam's falsified reports onto the table. "Gentlemen, Julian is compromised. But I have the capital to restructure this company and secure your dividends today," she declared, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. But her arrogant coup was brutally cut short. The board's chief legal counsel adjusted his glasses and slid a single, terrifying document across the mahogany table. "I'm afraid you have no authority here, Miss Sterling," the lawyer stated coldly. "The anonymous majority shareholder holding 51% of the voting stock has just awakened from dormancy and issued a strict injunction. All executive assets are frozen, and your motions are entirely vetoed." The smug, victorious smirk on Chloe's face dissolved into sheer, unadulterated horror as she realized her elaborate manipulation of Julian had gained her absolute control over a completely locked vault. By Friday afternoon, the final nail was driven into Julian's coffin. A heavily armored courier delivered a black envelope directly to his desk, containing a formal summons for an extraordinary board meeting. The mandate was chillingly brief, demanding the mandatory attendance of both Julian and Chloe. My head of intelligence, Marcus, handed me the live audio feed from Julian's office, smirking as we listened to the chaos. "Call the Taylors. Get the PR team in here immediately." Julian screamed at his new, terrified secretary through the feed. "This phantom billionaire is our only lifeline. I don't care what it takes. We are going to charm this person into bailing us out, or we are all completely dead." He was frantically preparing to beg, utterly blind to the reality of his impending slaughter. Meanwhile, in the hushed, velvet-lined dressing room of my Vanguard suite, I stepped into a custom-tailored, obsidian black power suit that hugged every curve of my body, permanently discarding the dowdy beige blazers I used to hide beneath. I pinned a brilliant diamond lapel clip exactly where the cheap leather cord used to rest. I was no longer the bleeding prey. I was the apex predator, and the boardroom hunt was finally on. The atmosphere in the Thorn Enterprises boardroom on Monday morning was so thick with tension, it could have been sliced with a diamond blade. I arrived an hour before the scheduled extraordinary meeting, bypassing the bewildered front desk security, using the platinum executive override card that had always belonged to me. The sprawling mahogany table was flanked by the nervous, sweating figures of the minority shareholders, men who had spent the last week watching their generational wealth hemorrhage. I took my seat at the head of the table, the massive, high-backed leather chair reserved exclusively for the chairman, and slowly spun it around to face the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gray Manhattan skyline. I could hear the heavy mahogany doors swing open behind me, followed by the unmistakable, arrogant click of Julian's Oxford shoes and the sharp staccato of Chloe's Louboutins. They were conversing in hushed, urgent whispers, practicing the pathetic, groveling pitches they had spent the entire weekend polishing. "Gentlemen," Julian's voice rang out, vibrating with a desperate, artificial bravado, meant to project absolute control. "Let us welcome our savior and finalize this transition smoothly." I wouldn't call myself a savior, Julian. In fact, I'm quite the opposite, I said, my voice echoing off the acoustic paneling, low and carrying a glacial authority. I placed both hands on the armrests and slowly rotated the heavy leather chair until I was facing the entire room. The collective gasp that sucked the oxygen from the boardroom was nothing short of symphonic. Julian froze mid-step, the glossy pitch portfolio slipping from his manicured hands and hitting the carpet with a dull, pathetic thud. Chloe's jaw dropped so fast, she looked physically unhinged, her heavily contoured face draining of all color as her eyes locked onto my obsidian power suit and the diamond lapel clip resting where my bruised skin used to be. Maya Julian choked out, the name tearing from his throat like a jagged piece of glass. He blinked rapidly, his brain violently rejecting the reality standing before him. What the hell kind of sick joke is this, security? How did this delusional? I fired assistant get past the lobby. He lunged toward the intercom, panic stripping away his polished billionaire facade in an instant. Before Julian's trembling finger could even graze the intercom button, the chief legal counsel, Mr. Sterling, no relation to Chloe, much to her eternal chagrin, stood up and slammed a thick, sealed document onto the center of the table. Sit down and shut your mouth. Mr. Thorne. The elderly lawyer barked, his voice dripping with utter disdain. You are not addressing a fired assistant. You are addressing the chief executive officer of Vanguard Apex, and the verified legal proxy holding exactly 51% of Thorne Enterprises' voting stock. Julian collapsed into the nearest chair as if the bones in his legs had suddenly evaporated. Chloe gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white as she shook her head in frantic denial. No. No. That is impossible, she shrieked, shedding her elegant, aristocratic persona to reveal the desperate, clawing opportunist beneath. She's a thief. We have the audit reports. She embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars. You can't let a criminal take over this company. She gestured wildly toward Liam, who was cowering in the corner, designated for junior note-takers, sweating profusely. I didn't raise my voice. True power never needs to shout. I simply reached into the sleek leather portfolio resting in front of me and slid a stack of meticulously bound Vanguard intelligence dossiers across the polished wood. Since Miss Sterling is so fiercely passionate about audits, I said smoothly, leaning forward and steepling my fingers, let's review the true financials. Shall we? I tapped the top file. These are the unredacted wire transfers proving that Chloe Sterling paid off a $500,000 gambling debt belonging to Liam's mother, precisely 48 hours before my alleged embezzlement was discovered. Furthermore, we have recovered the raw server logs that Liam attempted to delete. They clearly show him accessing the master ledger using a forged credential token generated from Chloe's personal IP address at the Pierre Hotel. The minority board members eagerly snatched up the documents, their eyes widening in horror and fury as the undeniable proof of the conspiracy materialized in their hands. Liam let out a pathetic, stifled sob, burying his face in his hands, fully aware that his life was effectively over. Chloe staggered backward, her perfectly lined lips trembling as she looked frantically toward Julian for salvation. But Julian wasn't looking at her. He was staring at me with a sickening mixture of terror and awe. Finally recognizing the monstrous intellect he had blindly insulted for 5 years, you framed the only person holding this company together. One of the senior board members snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Chloe. You stupid, arrogant little girl. You nearly bankrupted us all, just to play corporate dress-up. Chloe burst into theatrical tears. A desperate, manipulative reflex she had perfected over a lifetime of avoiding consequences. Julian, tell them it was your idea to get rid of her because she was obsessed with you, she wailed, throwing her fiancé directly under the oncoming train. But the room was completely indifferent to her performance. The predators had smelled blood, and they knew exactly who the true prey was. I raised a single hand, instantly silencing the chaotic murmurs of the board, and locked my gaze onto Julian's pale, sweating face. The embezzlement frame job was merely a pathetic distraction, I announced, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. The real issue today is the matter of legacy. I gestured to the chief legal counsel, who solemnly unlocked his brass-bound briefcase and produced an ancient, yellowed envelope sealed with red wax. When your grandfather, Richard Thorne, passed away, Julian, he didn't leave the majority of this empire to you. He knew you were impulsive, vain, and entirely unequipped to lead. Julian flinched as if he had been struck. He placed the 51% in a blind trust overseen by Vanguard Apex, with a very specific, ironclad clause. The trust would only be transferred to you if you demonstrated loyalty, competence, and basic human decency for 5 consecutive years. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer, and walked slowly toward Julian's end of the table. I wasn't your assistant, Julian. I was your final exam. I was the guardian your grandfather placed by your side to protect you from your own catastrophic stupidity. Julian stared up at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps as the devastating reality of his 5-year delusion finally crushed him. The trust was secured in a physical vault at the Vanguard headquarters. I continued, stopping right beside his chair and looking down at him with absolute, freezing contempt. A vault that could only be opened by a specific, customized bronze key. A key that your grandfather instructed me to wear at all times, to see if you would ever notice the weight of the legacy hanging right in front of your eyes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the tarnished bronze key, the heavy metal clinking against the mahogany table as I tossed it directly in front of him. You didn't just fire me, Julian. You didn't just humiliate me in front of your sycophants. You forcefully severed the chain holding your inheritance, broke the morality clause of the trust, and explicitly ordered the guardian of your wealth to leave. You threw away the key to your own kingdom because you thought it looked cheap. The silence that followed was apocalyptic. Julian stared at the bronze key resting on the wood, his hands hovering over it, trembling so violently he looked as though he was seizing. No, he whispered, a guttural, pathetic sound of complete surrender. No, Maya, please, you can't do this. I'm a thorn. This is my company. It has my name on the building. He looked up at me, tears of genuine, agonizing regret spilling down his cheeks, desperately searching for a shred of the devoted assistant who had always fixed his mistakes. He found absolutely nothing but a polished black mirror reflecting his own ruin. The name on the building is just glass and steel. Julian, I replied, my voice completely devoid of empathy. I turned back to the board, projecting my final verdict. As per the stipulations of the breached trust, the 51% reverts entirely to the Vanguard Apex executive portfolio. Julian Thorne is hereby stripped of all titles, assets, and privileges associated with this corporation. Effective immediately. The slaughter was complete. The king was dead, and I was holding the bloody crown. The heavy silence in the boardroom was finally shattered by the frantic, scraping sound of a chair being violently pushed back. Clue Sterling, realizing that her meticulously constructed fantasy of becoming the undisputed queen of New York high society had just evaporated, turned her terrifying panic toward the nearest target. She looked at Julian, not with the adoring, submissive gaze she had weaponized for months, but with the raw, venomous hatred of a cornered rat. You pathetic, useless idiot, she hissed, her voice vibrating with genuine disgust as she aggressively yanked the massive diamond engagement ring off her left hand. She hurled the multi-million-dollar stone directly at Julian's chest, where it bounced off his ruined lapel and clattered meaninglessly next to the bronze key. I am not going down for your incompetence. I only did what you wanted. Julian, you hated her. You wanted her gone, and I just helped you. She spun toward the stony-faced board members, her artificial tears flowing as she desperately tried to weave a new lie, claiming she was a victim of his psychological manipulation. But the board members simply stared at her with the cold, unfeeling eyes of executioners watching a spectacle, their patience entirely exhausted. Before Chloe could utter another pathetic sob, the heavy mahogany doors swung open again, revealing 4 stern-faced NYPD detectives holding manila folders that perfectly matched the Vanguard dossiers I had provided. The lead detective didn't even blink at the opulent surroundings as he read out the arrest warrants for grand larceny, corporate fraud, and malicious forgery. Liam, who had been completely catatonic in his corner, let out a high-pitched, broken wail and immediately offered his wrists, completely broken by the weight of his own betrayal. Chloe, however, fought like a wild animal. She shrieked, kicking her designer heels and scratching at the officers as they forcefully clamped the cold steel handcuffs around her delicate wrists. "Do you know who my father is? You can't do this to me, Julian. Do something," she screamed, her voice cracking as she was unceremoniously dragged out of the boardroom. Julian didn't move a single muscle, watching his beautiful, toxic illusion get hauled away to a concrete cell, with the conspirators removed. The crushing reality of Julian's isolation finally settled over him like a suffocating shroud. The chief legal counsel adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, delivering the final, merciless blow without a shred of sympathy. "Mr. Torn, as per the mandate of the Vanguard Trust, you are legally trespassing on private corporate property. You have exactly 0 equity in this firm, and your personal assets tied to the company accounts have been frozen pending a full audit of your catastrophic mismanagement." Julian opened his mouth to speak, to beg the men who used to laugh at his jokes, but they all deliberately looked away, severing him from their elite circle forever. The same 2 massive security guards who had roughly escorted me out into the freezing rain just days prior stepped into the room, their expressions grim. They didn't offer Julian a cardboard box for his personal effects, nor did they give him 15 minutes to compose himself. They simply grabbed him by the arms of his custom Italian suit and hoisted him to his feet. Hauling the former king away, Julian's descent from the 82nd floor was a silent, agonizing march to the gallows. But the true punishment awaited him on the ground floor. Vanguard's media division had discreetly leaked the explosive news of his ousting and the ongoing criminal investigation to every major financial outlet in the city. The moment the elevator doors slid open into the grand marble lobby, a blinding explosion of camera flashes and chaotic shouting violently assaulted him. Dozens of ruthless reporters, paparazzi, and eager bloggers surged forward, entirely ignoring the velvet ropes, are hungry for the blood of a fallen billionaire. "Julian, is it true you bankrupted your grandfather's legacy, Mr. Thorne? Did your fiancé really forge documents to frame your assistant? How does it feel to lose 51% of your net worth in a single morning?" The vicious questions rained down on him, amplifying the exact same public humiliation he had so eagerly inflicted upon me at the Pierre Hotel. Only this time, the audience wasn't a room full of polite socialites. It was the entire unforgiving world, watching him stumble out of the sliding glass doors like a disgraced vagrant. Hours later, the manicured skies over Manhattan darkened, and the heavens broke open, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour that perfectly mirrored the day I had been banished. I stepped out of the Vanguard Apex Tower, the evening air sharp against my face, entirely unbothered by the rain, as my security detail held a massive black umbrella over my head. My chauffeured Maybach was idling at the curb, its slate, obsidian surface reflecting the neon lights of the city that now belonged to me, just as my driver opened the rear door. A pathetic, soaking wet figure detached itself from the shadows of a nearby alleyway and desperately threw itself toward the vehicle. It was Julian. His expensive suit was plastered to his shivering body, ruined by the mud and the rain. His perfectly styled hair plastered flat against his pale, sunken face. He slammed his trembling hands against the tinted glass of my car door, the security guards instantly lunging forward to tackle him. But I raised a single, gloved hand to stop them. I wanted to look him in the eye one last time. I slowly lowered the window just a few inches, the mechanical hum cutting through the drumming rain, and looked down at the man who had once been the center of my universe. Julian instantly dropped to his knees in the filthy gutter water, his fingers frantically gripping the edge of the window frame, as if I were the last life raft on a sinking ship. "Maya, please," he sobbed, his voice raw and unrecognizable, entirely devoid of the arrogant billionaire who had sneered at my curvy figure and working-class roots. I was blind. I was so incredibly stupid. Chloe poisoned my mind. She made me doubt you. But I see it now. I see everything. You were the only one who ever truly cared about me. The only one who protected me. He was crying openly, the rain mixing with his pathetic, desperate tears. "I love you, Maya. I always have. Please. I have nothing left. No money. No home. No friends. Just give me another chance. Let me show you I can be the man you deserve. We can run the empire together." I stared down at his weeping, kneeling form, searching my heart for even a microscopic fraction of the devotion or the pain that used to bind me to him. I found absolutely nothing but a vast, peaceful emptiness, completely wiped clean of his toxic influence. He didn't love me. He loved the convenience of my competence, the safety net of my brilliance. And now that he was free-falling into poverty, he was simply trying to grab the closest parachute. I didn't yell. I didn't express anger. And I didn't offer him the closure of an emotional farewell. I calmly reached into my designer handbag, my fingers brushing past the keys to my penthouse and the encrypted drives of my empire, until I found what I was looking for. I pulled out a single, dull, silver quarter. I held it between my pristine, manicured fingers, extending my hand through the narrow gap of the window, and let it drop. The coin hit Julian's cheek and splashed into the muddy puddle, resting right between his ruined, shivering knees. "That is your severance pay, Julian," I said, my voice as calm and indifferent as a gentle breeze passing over a graveyard. "Make it last," without waiting for his reaction, without needing to see the total. Crushing despair finally break him into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I hit the button to roll up the window, the tinted glass smoothly sealed shut, entirely cutting off the muffled sounds of his anguished wailing and completely erasing him from my world. I settled back into the plush, heated leather seats of the Maybach, instructing my driver to take me home as the luxury car pulled away from the curb, leaving Julian Thorne kneeling in the gutter to be swallowed by the shadows. I poured myself a glass of vintage champagne from the console. I took a slow sip, looking out at the glittering, towering skyline of Manhattan through the rain-streaked windows. The frightened, overworked assistant had died on a glass floor a week ago, leaving behind a woman forged in absolute fire. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was ruling, and the view from the apex was unimaginably beautiful.